Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program that Shaped Our World by Vincent Bevins, is a powerful and chilling exploration of the Cold War's covert actions, particularly in Southeast Asia. The book traces the origins and consequences of the mass killings in Indonesia in 1965 and 1966, revealing a much broader, darker aspect of U.S. foreign policy during the period. Bevins uncovers how the U.S. supported or even directly facilitated violent anti-communist purges in countries around the world, often in the name of containing communism, but with devastating consequences. Context: the Cold War and the fear of communism. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, marked by ideological, military, and economic competition. One of the most fundamental aspects of this rivalry was the fear of communism, especially after the successful Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. In the post-World War II era, the U.S. led the Western Bloc in a concerted effort to stop the spread of communism across the globe, a strategy known as containment. Communism, seen as an existential threat to the capitalist order and democratic values, was feared to be spreading in both Europe and the developing world. By the early 1960s, Southeast Asia had become one of the primary theaters in this ideological struggle. The U.S. supported regimes that were opposed to communism, even if those regimes were authoritarian or engaged in brutal repression. In this context, the Jakarta Method details the rise of a form of anti-communist violence that would become a signature feature of U.S. policy in the region. Indonesia, the Jakarta Method unfolds. The main event that inspired the title of Bevins' book is the 1965 to 1966 Indonesian mass killings, which were part of a broader wave of political violence sweeping the country. Indonesia, under President Sukarno, had adopted a non-aligned stance in the Cold War, refusing to fully commit to either the Soviet or American side. This was viewed with suspicion by both superpowers, but the U.S. was particularly concerned due to Indonesia's growing left-wing movements, especially the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI. In 1965, the Indonesian military, led by General Suharto, launched a coup against President Sukarno. This was, in part, a reaction to an attempted coup by a faction of the Indonesian military that was sympathetic to left-wing ideologies. The military and right-wing groups used this moment to initiate a mass purge of suspected communists, left-wing sympathizers, and anyone associated with the PKI. Bevins reveals that the U.S. played a crucial role in these killings, offering logistical support, intelligence, and diplomatic cover to the Indonesian regime. The American embassy in Jakarta provided the Indonesian military with lists of suspected communists, many of whom were then rounded up and murdered in brutal ways. The killing was not confined to the political elite, but extended to rural areas where entire villages were wiped out in the name of purging communism. Estimates of the death toll vary, but it is widely accepted that between 500,000 and 1 million people were killed in the purges. This event is central to the narrative of the Jakarta Method because it demonstrates how the U.S. played an active role in supporting violent, undemocratic regimes as long as they were staunchly anti-communist. The Indonesian genocide was just one example of a broader strategy of supporting violent anti-communist actions in various parts of the world. Globalizing the Jakarta Method. While the Indonesian mass killings serve as the book's focal point, Bevins argues that this was not an isolated incident. The Jakarta Method, as he calls it, was exported from Indonesia to other parts of the world where the U.S. sought to eliminate communist influence and ensure that pro-American governments would hold power. This form of state-sponsored violence took root in Latin America, Africa, and other parts of Southeast Asia. In Latin America, the U.S. supported military coups, like the 1973 Chilean coup against President Salvador Allende, which mirrored the Indonesian approach of using violence to eliminate perceived communist threats. In countries like Brazil, Guatemala, and El Salvador, the U.S. provided aid, training, and intelligence to military regimes that engaged in widespread human rights abuses, including torture and extrajudicial killings, to suppress leftist movements. Bevins shows that the methods used in Indonesia were exported to these regions with varying degrees of American involvement. The support for paramilitary death squads, military juntas, and secret police forces became a hallmark of U.S. foreign policy in the global South. The goal was always the same: to stop the spread of communism, often at the expense of democracy, human rights, and civilian lives. In Vietnam, the U.S. military conducted its own mass violence against civilians, most notably through the use of napalm and defoliants, with the aim of eliminating the Viet Cong. The broader strategy in Vietnam and other countries in the region often involved funding, training, and arming brutal regimes to combat leftist insurgencies. The Jakarta Method's legacy. The implications of the Jakarta Method are profound, not just for the people who lived through the violence, but for global history. Bevins shows that this cycle of violent intervention and covert operations was integral to the shaping of the modern world. In Southeast Asia, the US-backed regimes like Suharto's in Indonesia contributed to decades of political instability, poverty, and repression that continue to affect these countries today. In Latin America, the repercussions of US interventions in places like Chile, Argentina, and Guatemala led to decades of civil war, repression, and economic disparity. Many of the violent regimes in Latin America, backed by the US, continued to rule through terror for decades, with lingering effects on the region's political and social fabric. The Jakarta Method also demonstrates the US's willingness to sacrifice human rights in the name of ideological purity. The Cold War's anti-communist crusade often prioritized geopolitical considerations over moral or ethical ones, with devastating consequences for millions of innocent people. In many cases, the US supported brutal dictatorships that were more concerned with staying in power than with the welfare of their citizens. Moreover, the Jakarta Method highlights the importance of understanding the Cold War as more than just a geopolitical conflict between two superpowers. It was also a war of ideas, fought on the ground by millions of people, many of whom were caught in the crossfire of US intervention. The human cost of this struggle was immense and continues to shape the politics of many countries in the developing world. The Jakarta Method, by Vincent Bevins, provides an eye-opening account of the US's role in global violence during the Cold War. By connecting the mass killings in Indonesia to a broader pattern of US-backed anti-communist purges in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and beyond, Bevins forces readers to confront the moral complexities of the Cold War and its lasting consequences. The Jakarta Method was not just a series of isolated events, but part of a larger strategy of violence, repression, and covert operations designed to reshape the world in the image of the US and its allies. The legacy of this strategy is still felt today in the countries that were affected by it, and understanding this history is essential for a more complete picture of the global political landscape of the 20th century. Through meticulous research and first-hand accounts, Bevins offers a powerful critique of U.S. foreign policy and the human cost of the Cold War's anti-communist crusade. The Jakarta Method is a timely reminder that the struggle for political influence and control often comes at the expense of human lives, and it challenges us to reconsider the narratives that have shaped our understanding of history.